Good morning, everyone. I'm Renuka Sankaran, an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences here at Lehman College and one of the summit organizers. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Bronx Environmental Summit. I hope you had a chance to attend our first keynote address by Radley Horton, whose talk provides a nice segue to our first panel, New York's Climate Leadership Meets Biden's Climate Change Agenda, which will explore some of the environmental and societal impacts and risks associated with climate change, their implications for climate policy and environmental equity, the emerging needs for scientific information, and the challenges of integrating scientific knowledge into actionable policy. To provide their expertise on this challenging topic of integrating the science, policy, and equity issues, we have an amazing panel of experts who are waiting to discuss these ideas. I would like to take a moment to introduce the moderator for this panel, who is one of America's most honored and experienced environmental journalists, author, and educator, Andrew Revkin. He has won top awards in science journalism multiple times and has written acclaimed books on the history of humanity's relationship with weather, the changing Arctic, global warming, and the assault on the Amazon rainforest. In our conversation, Andrew mentioned that he has been to the North Pole, Amazon rainforest, the White House, the Vatican, and now he's here virtually at the Bronx Environmental Summit. Without further delay, I would like to turn it over to Andrew. Audience, please feel free to enter your questions for our panelists during the discussion into the Q&A box on your screen, which will be answered by the panelists during the Q&A session. Thank you all for being here.
Hold on. Okay, I think we're good. Good morning, or if any of you are remote, and well, you're all remote. If any of you are scattered across the landscape, good afternoon or good evening, depending where you might be. What a time this has been. I hope everyone here has had a chance to take a breath. We are 1 year into the pandemic, the lockdown that forced us into rooms like this instead of being able to gather in the places where I've met people like Marshall Shepard and the others on this panel who I know already. So give a hug to yourself and anyone in your bubble, first of all. Secondly, I was really glad to see a land acknowledgement this morning before Radley kicks things off. I'm privileged to live in the Hudson Valley, about 50 miles north of New York City, 30 miles north of the Bronx, in the Highlands, which were Lenape territory. And I always think deeply about the people who tended these landscapes around us long before modern life and colonial expansion happened. So I honor that as well. This is such an important conversation. You know, I've been writing about this thing called global warming since, I hate to say since before you were born, but for many of that's true. My 1988 cover story in Discover magazine, this is before the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, before the treaty that became that the Paris Agreement is a subset of. This is so long ago, 1988, that prize-winning climate science magazine had cigarette ads on the back. So I was selling global warming concern on the front while we were making a living, in part selling cigarettes and liquor and cars. And that, I think about that often too, because it says this is a very long process and there's aspects of the systems we live in that don't change easily. And global warming, if I had to choose, and I did choose a few years ago, I could keep writing articles like this. I have good colleagues all over the world who are writing great stories on climate change. What I try to do personally is I've moved toward facilitating conversations around climate solutions. And so many of those, basically the ones that really matter in the end, federal funding and federal action and everything Biden is doing is essential. But when you break global warming into its prisms, its contexts, the risk factors around global warming are all on the ground. And Radley's talk earlier, which I tucked in on, I was glad to hear him mention redlining. You know, there are aspects of history that led to vulnerability differences, even in the same cities that we all live in now. And those are actionable points that are on the ground, and we can work really hard to reduce greenhouse gases, which I've written about again for decades. But that's not going to change anyone's outcome on the ground in our lifetimes because the atmosphere has momentum, et cetera. So local is where it's at. And the Bronx is where it's at. You know, at Columbia now we're building a climate school, the School of Climate, the first new school at Columbia in 25 years. But every school essentially has a school of climate within it. If you have connectedness, if you get social scientists and the humanities and the folks who understand racist history in a city together with the folks who are doing urban planning and thinking about climate resilience, then you can have a climate school. And so my hope today is that we'll come away with some action paths that you at Lehman and with your neighboring communities and with the university community more generally can go forward on. That's the key here. And climate risk is a really important lens. Put that word risk, like wake up with that word in your head and it starts to identify where the injustice is, where the solutions are. I'd like to start right away to not waste time, by bringing in this wonderful panel who are leaders in all of these facets of the problem that together can make a difference. My favorite people in the world, many of them are climate scientists, but they have to be interacting with people who are on the ground as well. So Sonal Jessel is Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. We Act is the acronym. And We Act is a good friend of Columbia and vice versa. It's a great organization you'll learn more about. Robin Leichenko is Professor and Chair of the Department of Geography at Rutgers University, co-director of Rutgers Climate Institute. And some of my favorite climate scientists are at Rutgers. Alan Robach, who I dealt with on nuclear winter way back in the 80s before my story is there. So Rutgers has done great work in this. Other people there as well, Bob Kopp. Marshall Shepard, Georgia Athletic Association Distinguished Professor of Geography and Atmospheric Sciences, University of Georgia, former president of the American Meteorological Society, and a fantastic blogger and a resident of Twitter. I hope you could talk a little bit about the importance of communication and getting outside of bubbles, because you've done a great job. Maybe we'll talk about Forbes and why you chose to blog in a place that people don't associate with climate. And Dan Zarrilli, who's been involved in government and at the city level for a very long time on resilience, and now is Chief Climate Policy Advisor in the New York City's Office of the Mayor. So Dan, it's great to see you again. And again, there have been times when I've seen you in person, but this is next best. So my first question for you all, and I guess we'll start with Sonal, is how did you become you? Just a very quick snapshot. I think it's important, especially for young people, to know that there are not a lot of straight lines in the careers of people in this field. And maybe one of you grew up to be who you are. You just came out of the womb and said, I'm going to be. But so a quick sense on all of how you kind of got focused on your aspect of this problem.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. And how I became me was definitely not a straight path. So for those of you out there that feel like you're not going on something perfectly linear, that's okay. Once someone told me life is really just random, and that really struck a chord with me. I originally thought I was going to be a doctor. I was very interested in health. That was really my way into environmental justice and environmental health work. And through my exposure to the medical world and my foray into it, I decided that wasn't for me, that I felt like I wasn't addressing the really systematic kind of population level issues that I was really interested in and motivated by. And I think that's what took me into going to school in public health, where I got my degree in public health at Columbia University, Mailman School of Public Health. And that's where I really kind of delved into environmental justice as a topic that I could actually work in. It was always a topic that I liked and was interested in, but really couldn't figure out how to have a job in it. It felt like more, I was seeing big green groups, and there just wasn't as much of that, I wasn't getting as much exposed to the grassroots groups as much as I would have wanted to. So I was really lucky to kind of learn that this is something I can really delve very deep into in an actual job. But yeah, I mean, one reason why my vantage point is very much environmental justice instead of environmentalism is because I grew up in a house very focused on social justice and gender justice particularly. And so my brain was already very wired towards how do we work on people that are marginalized, how do we address issues of race and issues of class and issues of gender, coming from the background that I came from, which is I'm a multiracial person. My mom is from Punjab, India, and so she comes from a group of people that have experienced a lot of marginalization in their history. And so I came into environmental work, I came into public health work with that as like the overarching framework, and squeezed my way into We Act. And now I'm here. And that's the short answer of how I became me.
And can you give a thumbnail sketch of We Act's role in this, specifically with a climate lens?
Yes. So We Act for Environmental Justice is a grassroots organization, a community-based organization that has been based in West Harlem since 1988. We Act got its start when our executive director and co-founder Peggy Shepard and other activists were fighting against this placement of a toxic facility in West Harlem, yet another toxic facility in West Harlem. At the time, West Harlem was dealing with really, really high rates of asthma, very poor air quality, and it was and still is a mostly Black and African American community. So there was very clear acts of environmental racism happening in West Harlem, where toxic facilities were being placed in this Black and African American community over the wider, wealthier communities in other parts of Manhattan. So We Act got its start by community organizing and by direct action. And to this day, that is still what we do. We've just expanded. So now we don't only do community organizing with people in Northern Manhattan, and now we do, we work in Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood. So we've kind of expanded to all of Northern Manhattan. But we also work on policy work, which is my role in the organization, where we address and write or take away policies and programs that promote healthy communities in Northern Manhattan. So we work on the city level, the state level, and we also have an office in DC. And right now we're really excited to help kind of build out the climate plan for this new administration as well.
And that's a perfect example of how you can create these pipelines from the grand national goal and beyond that, the global goal to local action. So that's really great and exciting. Robin, Leichenko, you know, the field of geography seems pretty boring. In fact, Columbia, I think it was 20 or so years ago, eliminated its geography department. And as a journalist covering climate risk, I've become more and more attuned to the importance of geography. And maybe you could tell us how you came to be you and a little bit of that context in there. You know, why geography as opposed to climatology or the like?
Sure thing. Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah. Well, let me start out by saying one time when my younger son was about 8 or 9 years old, he said, "Why do you do geography, Mama? Geography, it just sounds boring." So I do get that a fair bit. So I guess just in terms of my history and how I got here into this sort of geography space, geography is really a discipline that lets you study environmental issues. It lets you sort of make the connections between political problems and environmental problems. So it really fits me perfectly. But I actually was an English major when I started in college, and I stayed an English major. I graduated with an English degree. But in that process of, you know, exploring kind of other classes, like the one fun class that you're going to take when you're also loading up your major or meeting your core requirements, was a class actually on environmental conservation with someone who I think Andy knows, named Diana Liverman, who's now she's actually a professor at University of Arizona at this time, and, you know, many other things as well. But so this was like, you know, the 1980s, the time of sort of like there was a major famine in Ethiopia at that time. This was like there was like the Live Aid concert. So this is going back to sort of the magazine Andy showed, the cover of his magazine, even before that time period. But there was sort of this growing awareness, I would say, that what we were calling environmental problems, we were calling a famine caused by a drought, was actually a political problem. And I think that connection between the political context, the economic context that creates and shapes environmental problems, that's been just a theme throughout my work. But just a couple more sort of touch points. I sort of, you know, began taking courses. I joined a club that was actually an Oxfam club on campus. I was at the University of Wisconsin. I started getting involved in a professor's research project. So I was sort of doing all the things that I bet a lot of the students in the room are hearing from their professors. Join a club that interests you, try to work with a professor. I actually did those things and connected with those things. And I think another important element was that I was able to actually connect. At that time, there were very few tenured women in geography. There were no department chairs who were female in geography, probably in the entire country. But so that was really helpful, connecting with younger women. At that time, Diana Liverman was a new professor, connecting with other female role models, later Amy Glassmeyer at Penn State, and sort of having those people that kind of look like me that I can look up to and move toward and sort of follow. So those are just some of the, I think there's many other details, obviously, but some of the critical touch points.
That's so great. And I think what I like about geography, at least looking at landscapes and layering in the different sources of risk, is that it really pulls one back from a tendency to overinterpret something. In other words,
Yes.
as a journalist, we get caught up in thinking, oh, this is all global warming or whatever. And you realize, oh my gosh, no, we built so much vulnerability in this area, in this floodplain, that the main thing putting people at risk is where we build. And it's a way to use data to rigorously look at these layers. And there's a guy named Patrick Keyes at Colorado State who wrote a paper that I thought really important on Anthropocene risk. And he also says you have to look at history.
Sure.
Like in Iraq or whatever, what was the history of water use that led to the vulnerabilities that led to farmers coming in? Fantastic profession you're in. So I'm really glad you're part of this conversation. And now, Marshall Shepard, again, you have a very interesting, I know I'm not going to spill the beans, but your life has been a wonderful journey so far. Maybe you can weigh in on how you became you briefly, and we'll talk later about the communication stuff.
Sure. Thanks, Andy. And it's always great to work with you as someone that I've certainly read and admired from afar for many decades. So thank you for hosting and moderating this particular event. So to answer your question, I guess I have to start with a honeybee. And that may sound strange, but when I was a, fourth, fifth grader, I used to catch honeybees and insects in my yard. I wanted to do my sixth grade science project on honeybees because I thought I wanted to be an entomologist, study of insects. But I got stung by a honeybee and found out I was highly allergic to them and almost died. And those were pre-EpiPen days. Wow. So no one carrying EpiPens around at that time. So sixth grade science project rolls around and I said, I need a plan B, pun intended. And so I like weather also, started making weather instruments from things around the house. Just, didn't have fancy barometers and things like that. So just made them. And so did my science project, won the science fair, and kind of at that point knew I wanted to study weather. Didn't want to be a TV meteorologist, didn't want to forecast the weather in a National Weather Service office. I was always more interested in the how and why. So I guess I am that person that you talked about that sort of knew from fourth to fifth grade that I wanted to be a meteorologist. And so discovered that Florida State University had a really good meteorology program. So went there and did my bachelor's and master's degree, worked for a while, went back and did my PhD and spent the first part of my career as a scientist at NASA working on large satellite missions to study the weather and climate in the Earth Sciences Division. But then this is where there are some forks in the road came. I came to the University of Georgia after 12 years at NASA, became a professor at the University of Georgia, now the director of its atmospheric sciences program. By the way, my tenure at home is also in a geography department, though I don't have any degrees in geography. We also do have an atmospheric sciences degree at the University of Georgia as well. But during that time period, a lot of things kind of came my way, curveballs. I was asked to run for president of the American Meteorological Society and ended up winning. And so did that. After serving as president of that, the Weather Channel approached me and says, hey, everyone knows you and respects you. We want to do a meet the press, face the nation type weather talk show called Weather Geeks. Would you host it? So did that. And we did it as a TV show for about 4 years. And now I do it as a podcast. Weirdly and strangely, just recently was elected to the National Academy of Engineering. I have no idea how or why, but considering that I'm a scientist, but I guess there are some members that are scientists. So through all of those things, I've been able to sort of leverage my passion for weather and climate. But as we'll get into the discussion, some of my more recent work and thinking has really focused on how extreme weather and climate is impacting marginalized and frontline communities and so forth. And that's particular relevance to me because I come from those communities and some of my very family members would exhibit the exact vulnerability that many folks write about.
Fantastic. And I did post in the comment area to follow you on Twitter or your blogging or to check your podcast, because you've also been an exemplar of diving into the conversation around climate change, which can be really exhausting, dispiriting, and poisonous. But you have this singular quality, not unique, but the rare quality of listening carefully and trying to engage people from where they're coming from. So congratulations on all of that.
Thank you.
And Dan Zarrilli in the mayor's office, and from resilience to climate policy. Again, how did you become you quickly? And I can't wait to get to the next chapter here. We're going to get into the solution pathways.
Yeah, thanks. And it's really, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be remotely in the Bronx and with this great panel. How did I become me? So I started out my career as an engineer. I was trained as a civil engineer. I worked in the construction industry, did some work in the real estate industry. And I joined city government mostly to get onto the owner side and to help shape New York City's built environment. And it turned out to be, I was doing a lot of work on the city's waterfront. The cruise terminals, Hunts Point Food Distribution Center, a number of facilities like that. And honestly, it was Hurricane Sandy that was a major pivot point in my own career and my own life, and sort of thrust me into the climate space pretty directly in 2012. So maybe I'm a newcomer to this, having only really been in this space for about 8 years. But the last 8 years have really been a journey of preparing New York City for the future, and really thinking hard about the overlapping questions of adaptation. We launched a $20 billion adaptation program after Hurricane Sandy. The work we've done to align the city's greenhouse gas emission reductions with the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 Celsius target, which has been things like building retrofits and electric vehicles and a whole range of things the city has been doing and working to spur out, out in the wider, in the 5 boroughs. And then it's led us into work around divestment and investing in climate solutions using our pension funds, a whole range of activity that's been wildly different than I thought my career was going to be heading when I first started, to make your point. I think Sonal said it really well too. These things don't seem like straight, natural pathways when you start. Looking back, there's a certain logic to it, I think, of like one thing prepares you for the other. And as students, I would imagine, the kind of advice that is that might be helpful is, to make yourself available for opportunities, to fill voids, to step up and be ready for the kind of changes that are thrown at you in life. Because I never could have seen this coming, but it's been a really remarkable journey. And to be able to do it on the stage of New York City is really amazing.
And what a stage it is. It's a city that's got an amazingly large coastline for what seems like a very compressed city. And of course, we live in an era, as Marshall and other climate scientists and Robin have worked on, seas are going to be rising for centuries to come. It's only a matter of how fast. And you've been in the thick of it, as the politics of that is really hard. It was like when Bloomberg, his last year in office, Mayor Bloomberg, gave a speech on the waterfront in which he basically said, "We will not retreat." And I thought, as a blogger at the New York Times at that time, I rarely voiced an opinion, but there I kind of said, come on, this is very unscientific. There's no way you can say, his point was that New York's existing coastlines are its greatest asset. And I said, but then I said to myself, and I'll say to all you too, this is, how do you write a speech? Like if I think I was posing this question sometimes at conferences, especially to young people. I'd say, if you're the press officer for the next mayor of New York, and she picks up a study that really makes it clear that seas are rising for centuries to come. If you're the press officer and the mayor says, write me a speech that says we will retreat. And yeah, right. It's like a laugh line, because how do you write that speech and still stay in office? This relates to everyone's roles here. So Dan, maybe briefly, this is a transition to this question of policy and where do we go from here? Some of this is really hard to, the politics is harder than the engineering or the sort of the basic solutions sometimes.
Well, and I think the absolute worst time to try to have that conversation is right after a disaster, when people are trying to get back
Yeah.
in their homes and, the recovery process is going on. The city has done some really remarkable things in the intervening years, and there have been, targeted buyouts in certain, vulnerable areas. There's been a lot of really interesting zoning work from our Department of City Planning to overlay the known climate risks, particularly on the coastline, where there's been a lot of work on to really start baking that into our land use and our building code decisions, and how we build, where we build. That I think is the absolute right way to do that, is to really start baking these the climate science. And this has been with the work of the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and thank you, Robin, for your participation in that. Taking that science and making it actionable, not in one-off decisions, but really in our codes and standards and zoning and building codes and all those things where we need to make sure that every dollar we spend is making ourselves and our city more resilient.
That's there you go. And so here we are now talking about the grand ambitions at the national level. With Biden in office, we really are poised as a possibility, depending on political outcomes in 2022, 2024, of changing course on climate in a pretty big way. The recent spending bill that got passed through included a substantial amount of climate relevant funding, billions, not by that name. It wasn't a climate bill. So that implies there are things that can get done. So here comes my next question for each of you, and back to you, Sonal. What keeps you up at night, or wakes you up early in the morning, or both, when you see this opportunity expressed and potentially manifested, and know the inertia on the ground, that New York has 1 million buildings? That statistic keeps just making my mind, giving you a headache. And so we have these ambitious laws, like New York City has a law for buildings, retrofits and stuff, and the state has an ambitious climate law. So what does that mean on the ground, though? Like, how do you get going? What's the thing that you think is sort of, Sonal, is an unexpressed opportunity, or something that people really aren't thinking about that they should?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think that what keeps me up at night, the answer is a lot of things. It's not just one.
Well, that's part of it. We're surrounded by issues. So that's kind of part of the challenge, right?
Exactly. There's too many things. But I think the overarching theme of what keeps me up at night or wakes me up early in the morning is, especially right now with a stimulus that was insanely large. I mean, it was big. It was a lot of money. How do we secure that money for the communities of color and communities most impacted by climate change, and are dealing with not only, climate change impacts don't happen in a vacuum, right? People that are dealing with the impacts of climate change are also dealing with other environmental risks, food insecurity, water insecurity, energy insecurity, just racial violence, all of these different things. And so I'm always thinking of, how do we secure that money for communities that need it the most, and make sure it doesn't get, too diverted in other directions in a way that's not equitable or not addressing the corest of issues that we have, which historically is what happens. So when all this money was coming in it is coming in from the federal government, when programs are getting funded to a level higher than they ever had because of COVID-19, such as the Home Energy Assistance Program that we work a lot on to address extreme heat issues and need for people to cool their homes. How do we make sure that money is coming to the people that need it the most?
Right.
And how do we make sure there's not so many, bureaucratic steps and so many layers of red tape that it makes it impossible for people to actually get that funding that they need? I mean, especially thinking of the Local Law 97, and which you mentioned, of New York City's law to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from buildings by a huge amount. We are thinking about, how do we make sure that people that are living in buildings that are affordable housing, lower income buildings in environmental justice communities, are receiving the funding and subsidies to get their buildings to, not only hit the emissions reductions targets, but be have healthier indoor air, which is really what we think of when we think of environmental justice. Is like, we're thinking of the air pollution piece, that people are very interested in. If our buildings are reducing our emissions, how do we get that clean air and that good ventilation and that healthy house that people are asking for? And so that's something we're thinking about a lot, is how do we get the funding, not only from the city, not only from the state, but the federal government, for major housing retrofits, and even just energy efficiency, weatherization for buildings, which can be a lot of low cost things actually that make a really big difference. How do we make sure that happens for people? And not only the money, but how do we make sure it's accessible? How do we make sure people know about it? How do we make sure people feel trusting of the folks that are allocating those programs and connecting people to programs? I think that's an important piece for community-based organizations, is to help get that word out and make sure that these programs are targeting the right people in the right places. So that's something we're really thinking about a lot. And also just thinking about how to make sure we uphold the city's climate law to the level that we want it and envision it can be, and make sure the solutions are staying local. The solutions are really focused on cutting emissions, and we're not focusing on any other type of solution there.
So what skill sets do you have at WEACT that are required to identify and pursue? How much of it's about law? How much of it's about lobbying? How much of it's about community engagement?
Yeah, we really.
And what am I forgetting?
The research.
Oh, right, research.
Yeah, we do that too. We do it all, essentially. WEACT kind of works in 3 tiers, or we kind of have 3 buckets of work, and they're all very needed. So we have the community organizing side, where we have people coming out, spreading the word, getting people connected with information, bringing high level governmental representatives or legislators to our meetings, so that the public community can interact with people that maybe they normally wouldn't be interacting with, and asking questions that they normally wouldn't get to ask. Things like that. That's a really important part of the work, and that's an important part of the awareness piece. But the awareness doesn't matter if we don't secure the thing that we want to make people aware of. So we have the policy piece and we have the research piece, and those are the 2 other buckets that work really hand in hand, where we conduct a lot of research, whether it's community-based research, less formal research, sort of like the gray literature style work, or in partnerships with institutions like Columbia. We conduct that research about poor air quality, about households that don't cool off at night on a hot day. I'm thinking of extreme heat a lot because that's one of the main things I'm working on now. We do that research, and then we use it for the advocacy piece. We use it to testify at city council. We use it to talk to our state legislators. We use it as evidence for the types of policies and changes we want to see. So we really need all of it. WEACT tries to kind of hit all of the different steps, so that, and I think it's important to have that kind of holistic model in an organization like ours, because we really are, we believe in community-led solutions, that we work with our community members. Like, we run programs, workshops, things like that, to kind of figure out what are the solutions to an issue that you're seeing. And we especially did that after Hurricane Sandy. Said, okay, climate change is here, community, what do we do? And then we use that to guide all of the work we do. So in order to have community solutions, we need to know how to do the research. We need to know how to kind of tell people about the policy. We need to know how to bring people and get them in the room. So we need all of those different buckets. It's all needed.
Well, this is a good transition to both Marshall at University of Georgia and Robin at Rutgers, which is the interface between the academic community and organizations like yours, and the interface between scientific advice and folks like Dan, city government, are really important. This climate school that Columbia is building, the intent is to be all about those interfaces. My job partially is, how do you build a more fluid connectivity so that we're listening to communities around us and not just putting out papers, and even blogging is insufficient because it's often one way. So maybe Robin first, Rutgers, of course, is a state. Rutgers is it a land grant university? I can't remember.
It is, yes.
So it kind of evolved with a model of serving the community, right? Not just doing science. And so how does that play out there for you?
Yeah, well, interestingly, with Sonal's comments, we, in terms of my own like literal work on the New York City panel on climate change, we worked quite a bit with We Act in terms of identifying ways to bring our charge for the third NPCC panel, New York City panel on climate change, was to identify ways for the, to recommend for the city to bring equity into climate change adaptation planning at the community level. And so one of the very first things that we did, along with the group, the group that was working with me, Sheila Foster and others, was to meet with actually We Act. We met with other groups. We met with The Point in the Bronx. We met with Uprose in Brooklyn, and sort of brought them into our working group. And I said, we want to identify ways to address equity and incorporate equity into the work of the panel. We can't do this as in an ivory tower as a bunch of academics. Sheila Foster's a law professor, I'm a geography professor, and so forth. It was really sort of the idea of the co-production sort of vision of, if we're going to create something that's going to be meaningful to communities, we have to do that with communities. And so I think that carries over into a lot of the work that's happening on climate change, a lot of the work that's being initiated at Rutgers via various entities and so forth, to sort of partner with communities, I would say. And all of the earliest comments you were making about things like retreat and what should the city do, I think it's sort of that interface. That's a question for the communities of the city to sort of grapple with, rather than a sort of top-down decision. So I think that's really become the way that we're moving forward on climate change resilience planning, is working with communities. So I feel like that's actually one of the things that gives me some inspiration, that this kind of growing recognition that it's okay to do science with communities, rather than science being separate from kind of the community.
Yeah, there's an amazing example of that at Columbia that the Moore Foundation initiated up in the Arctic, where they put out an offer to most funding in this area. This relates to what Marshall would talk about too, is whether it's the NSF or whatever, is with a goal in mind. We need to better understand sea ice changing. And but what Moore funded was a conversation between a local indigenous community in Kotzebue and a climate team that's planning to work with drones to model sea ice variability. This relates to New York City. It's just a different context. And so it was co-learning. It was actually co-design of the science. It wasn't even co-production of a report, bringing scientists together with, and I love that model, but it's such an anomaly. It's like so much the outlier. I want to do more of my discussions about it, because I ran a colloquium on it, and I just think, is there a way to maximize that potential, to work with We Act, or other organizations, in that case, indigenous community, where their concern is that their elders are going out on the ice in their snowmobiles and falling through the ice. The scientists' main concern is learning about sea ice change and the changing climate. Can we do something together? That model feels really exciting, and it feels like part of what could be the future. Marshall, so again, you've been in advisory approaches. University of Georgia also is very involved with, the state around it, as well as your work, at the federal level. So what's the path forward that relates to community generated outcomes that are better than they would otherwise be?
I've got quite a few thoughts on this. So I'll try to sort of condense them. The first thing is, I think we as universities fundamentally don't teach students correctly about being what I call end-to-end scientists. And I actually was involved with an effort here at UGA proposed to the National Science Foundation to fundamentally change that. I suspect we have students listening in today. If they're graduate students, they probably were entered a graduate program, took courses, took seminars, wrote a dissertation or a master's thesis, presented it at some conference. And that's what we teach graduate students to do. We don't teach them to be end-to-end scientists. We don't teach them how to engage with the media or engage with policymakers. And there are some fundamental shortcomings of that, because the way we communicate, as you've alluded to, with those audiences are very different than how we communicate in our theses and dissertations. In fact, they're absolutely inverted if you think about a triangle, because when we teach dissertation and theses, we teach to give all this background information and all our methodology and all of this thing, and then 200 pages later or an hour into the talk later, we give the result. Whereas when we're talking with stakeholders and policymakers and folks like Daniel, you got to kind of give the bottom line right up front and then sort of work. So I think we need to fundamentally change this sort of how we train the next generation of scholars, particularly scientists. Secondly, I'm very concerned as we engage in things like environmental justice, climate justice, something that we're working on with Georgia Tech, University of Georgia, something called thermal justice, where we're proposing to fundamentally re-engineer cities to make them more thermally equitable. I saw a comment in the chat about cities as heat sinks and needing to better distribute the population. Well, we know the urban heat island exists, and we know that redlining and some things have placed some at risk higher than others. So we're trying to think about how we engineer cities to change that, and we actually are working on that problem right now. But the point I'm making is that when we engage with broader communities, policy, and so forth, I've been concerned for a while, Andy, about the academic savior complex. This is this idea that we as academics know everything. We go into these communities, we tell them what's best for them, and don't hear them and engage from the ground up. I'm very bothered by it, actually, because I know some of these communities feel overstudied and marginalized. We pop in with our 3-year grants and then we pop out. And I'm thinking of the song "Pop Out" by Polo G, where he says we pop out at your party. But anyhow, we need a co-production of knowledge model, and one of my graduate students worked on that. She's a professor now at the University of Connecticut. We need to adopt these ideas of co-production of knowledge, where we're engaging communities from the start in efforts that involve them, and we need invested long-term sustained relationships with these communities too that are impacted, not just kind of popping in and out. The third and final thing that I will say about this question, Andy, you asked what wakes me up, what keeps me up at night. Just being African American. I'm a scientist that has thinks about these issues from the lens of science, but I've had my own sort of interesting experiences with assumptions about who I am, the successes I've achieved. I've been the president of the American Meteorological Society, standing in a hotel at a conference with 4 other former presidents. That I'm only the second African American that have served in the role as AMS president, and yet a woman walks up to me out of those 4 and asks if I was the airport shuttle driver. All 4 of us are standing there in suits, and these are challenges. And where I'm going with this is we are severely underrepresented in terms of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM, in terms of representation in these fields. And so as we move forward, I know that this challenge is going forward. I know that the career opportunities going forward are going to be in STEM, and yet there's still a fundamental disconnect in reaching communities here in Atlanta, reaching communities in New York, and so forth, and that next generation of scientists and engineers. So that's something that I continuously worry about as well.
Well, and that should worry everybody. My wife works in the field of sustainability education, teaching teachers how to teach us sustainability. And a big chunk of it is about the lack of inclusion and the presumptions of what's a good track in education for a person based on that person's self-perceptions. And there's so much work to be done there. So I'm really glad you brought that in too. I posted a couple of relevant links in the chat. Way back in 1997, Dan Kamen, who's an energy scientist at Berkeley, and Michael Dove at Yale, anthropologists, wrote a paper on the virtues of mundane science. And I just love that. That's end-to-end, it's end-to-end science. I hadn't heard that term, and I really appreciate it too. It's scientists with outcomes and communities in mind. So there's more work to be done there too in our academic models. So Dan, from your standpoint again, and we're going to get to the questions and stuff coming up. They're coming in from the audience. What are we not doing in academia that can help a city and a state and a country achieve these grand goals? Or what? I'm not just saying academia, but this is an academic conference, and what's not happening that what keeps you up at night in terms of connectedness or cohesion and towards solutions?
Yeah, I'm a few things in mind on this. One is that, especially my background as an engineer coming into a lot of these conversations, I can naturally think about sort of the physical impacts of what's going to happen when the climate science is presented. Where's there going to be more water? Where's there going to be more heat? And I think the things that keep me up at night are, of course, much more the social impacts and the things like, the public health challenges and the food insecurity and the conflict and migration and all of the sort of things that happen when those physical impacts begin to play themselves out, whether it's in New York City or around the globe. I think those are some really big challenges. And, when I think about, the kinds of things that academia is doing and doing well and things that can be done better, I always come back to the New York City Panel on Climate Change as like a model for that sort of sustained engagement and co-production of, the science at the beginning of asking the questions of what science we're even doing and needing so that it is actionable for policymakers. I think it's been a remarkable 10-year journey to create this place where we can have those conversations together and really be informed by the science and to bake that into the policy. I had the good fortune to serve on a federal advisory committee on the Sustained National Climate Assessment as a way to think about how the federal government was going to be doing more of this co-production model. Unfortunately, it was, of course, canceled and the whole effort was disbanded in 2017. But with the help of the American Meteorological Society, NYSERDA, and Columbia University, we ended up doing a lot of that work and still issuing the report. And as now we're in a position with the federal government, re-engaging on climate, of course, and the Biden administration stepping up and doing a lot on climate, that effort to create a sustained national climate assessment and the co-production models is gaining steam as well in Congress. And I think it's really important to find ways to support that effort and to really make sure that the science is informing the policy, it's engaging with communities so that it's not the paper that gets published and maybe it gets an academic audience, but it doesn't get a wider applicability in the policy space or with communities, but to really create the opportunity for that larger conversation. And I think, things like the New York City Panel on Climate Change are a great model for how we can do that, not just in New York City, but really around the nation and around the globe.
One thing I threw into the chat is the American Geophysical Union, which kind of like the American Meteorological Society is this huge entity, thousands of scientists. 7 or 8 or maybe close to 10 years ago, they created something called the Thriving Earth Exchange, which is like a match.com for expertise and communities with challenges, flooding, hydrologist, soil erosion, geographer, soil scientist and like, and it's also still tiny. Even after 7 years, I think they've done 150 projects. We need 10,000 or more projects. And so scale is the next issue I'm going to throw into the mix here, I think, which it's one of those words that just always bums me out when I think about energy transitions and like, so maybe we'll take on the New York City law, not the building law, 92, whatever it is. 97 is just an example of that, a million buildings, even with a sequenced approach, a grand challenge of, and we'll start with We Act. If you're a student or if you're going into a career, your early stages, how can you do the action on the ground and still ramify, still have it be, so like the New York City Panel on Climate is seen as a model by other cities or municipalities. How do you make that spread? So for We Act, do you interact a lot with other organizations in other cities or other parts of New York City even? How do you kind of spread the joy if you find a way to change light bulbs that's better than the old way?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yes, is the short answer. Yes, we do that. One thing that's really important for policy advocacy, sort of activism, it depends on how you define it, is the coalition work and the collaboration work. I think, in my, anecdotal experience over the past, since Local Law 97 passed, and that's really I started working on WEAC kind of right when that was starting. So I've been seeing it kind of evolve over the past year or so. And I think that it's really growing in the collaboration piece. It's really growing in especially groups like ours that haven't been involved in the energy conversations for decades. We've been shut out of those conversations for a very long time. And only like in the past couple of years, or even like this year, especially since the racial uprising this summer, I think that also really changed dynamics of who's allowed into rooms and who's asked to be in those rooms. It's new for us to be involved in those conversations on like the technical side, on the engineering side, on the sort of, what are our market-based solutions side.
Right.
So all of that is very new for, I'll speak for myself, for me, and for being in those kinds of, for environmental justice or grassroots groups to be involved in that conversation. And I think one way that we're reacting a lot to it is by talking to each other a lot and by collaborating with each other a lot. And that's not only just the groups in New York City or New York State that are doing it, because that's very much happening. But there's even an increase in different collaborations and different coalitions of groups that have popped up across the whole country. Like we're talking to groups in California a lot, because California has, is working on sort of the similar questions. They're grappling with what happened to carbon trading. What about our, air quality standards? What about our emission standards? Like, what about these things? And so, that I think is really rising a lot. And that's what's kind of helping us sort of figure out how do we, what are we asking for when we're thinking about the implementation of Local Law 97? And then in terms of the student action on the ground, I mean, I think one thing that's really, that I found to be what I think is kind of going right for We Act and successful right now is that we're very much listening to the issues and then addressing those. We're not, as someone who's not from the community that I'm working in, I'm not from Harlem, I'm not originally from New York City. How do I make sure that I'm removing my opinions and my assumptions from the conversation? And that's the part that's like very hard to do.
Yeah.
And takes a lot of patience and a lot of like self-checking and understanding the privilege you already come from, that I'm saying like, okay, here's the problem. Let me just ask you really open-ended questions and try not to tell you what I think the solutions are and just go based on that. And I think that's where we're finding areas of where people are telling us things like, oh, Local Law 97 is great, but that's not my building that's involved. Why don't I get better air quality in my building? Right. And so that's like, okay, now I'm motivated by that comment. And that's the work that I'm focusing on now. So I think for students doing action on the ground and researching on the ground, when you kind of like are doing the work, try to come in with a really, really open mind and try to not put your assumptions on the process and really listen to people and be guided by that. Don't figure out exactly what you want to do and kind of force that to happen. And also be really patient, because I think with universities and doing research with universities and being someone that used to be the university side for research and now is on the community side, I think universities and researchers really underestimate how much work it takes to bring community into a research process. Honestly, that's the hard part. Planning the study, doing the IRB, moving that forward to me is a piece of cake compared to how do we engage the public? How do we bring people into meetings? How do we make people interested? So I think also like making sure we're giving a lot of time and resources for that side of the process is very important.
That's so important. And that word patience is another thing that's hard to reconcile with the sense of urgency that we all feel around the climate problem. It was like 10 years ago, someone was asking me about that. And I said, somehow we have to figure out a way in our own heads to put the word urgency and the word patience in the same sentence. Like it's like you wake up urgent, find the thing you can do, but you have to have that patience to understand these are systemic issues that don't just magically transform. It's really hard to do that even at my stage of my career, let alone coming out of high school or college where you just want to make the world the way you want it to be. So that's a really important framing, and that you noticed there. There's some really great questions coming in. I want to get to some of them even while we're still in sort of conversation. One student is asking, for those who aren't studying environmental science, how does that fit in with climate solutions? What strategies can all people, academic or not, do to aid environmental sustainability? And I imagine you all have some answers for that. Maybe Sonal, just quickly, you know, I guess you would like looking around the office when you're in the office or looking around your Zoom screen when you're talking to your colleagues. How many of them are scientists?
Not many.
Right. So there, what are some of the other jobs? Like, what are some of the other facets of the work?
Yeah. I think, like, especially with environmental justice, it's not just a climate issue. It's you know, in order to really address environmental injustice, you have to be thinking about all these other issues that you know, occur. Like I was saying at the beginning, that there's cumulative hardships. That's the thing, is that the people affected by climate change are dealing with so many other things. You can't look at climate change in a vacuum. So we work with, you know, affordable housing people. That's not really a traditional like science or climate change related field, but it's very important to work with them. Community organizers don't have a scientific background very often. Sometimes they do, but you just, you know, you have to know how to connect with people, how to translate that information. I myself, I guess I'm technically sort of a scientist, but public health is, you know, I think of myself more in the sort of sociology side of the work, less like the, you know, climate science side of the work. And that's really important for kind of putting the science into perspective of what this means for the world, and what this means for people. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different types of jobs you can have. Pretty much every single industry you can think of, there's some reason why they need to be thinking about climate change and connected with climate change. So even if that's not what your degree is in, or that's not, you know, the title of your job is climate change, you're still connected to it in some way. And there's so many ways, but those are just some examples.
I'm going to flip to Dan, just to jump the line here a little bit in terms of within city government too. When you think of the parts of government that deal with climate risk, one way or the other, it's everything, right? It's real estate, it's urban planning, it's teaching. I remember years ago I wrote about a colleague who had been in the sustainability office of the mayor, I guess under Bloomberg, who she realized the city wasn't training young people to handle these new technologies for controlling the climate in buildings. The city got a grant to make its school buildings more efficient, but they didn't have people. The labor, the union didn't have the population to run the new technology. And so they created a school in the Bronx. It's the High School for Energy and Technology. I went there once and it was so inspiring. Young people, mostly people of color, mostly low income because of the realities of the New York City school system, who are going to go into the jobs that we would need to have this shiny, cleaner environmental future. So it seems to be literally everything, right? So
I mean, what a great example. And you know, it's just become clear to me. I think there's some probably, you know, everyone would nod their head in some way to this, that we have to stop thinking of climate change as some niche environmental issue. It's an all of society issue. And I think it's spot on to think about, you know, how climate is going to play itself out in, you know, different economic sectors and different social sectors. It's why when we put out the city's most recent long-term strategic plan, climate was at the core of that plan, but we were, you know, integrating that with whether it's our education system or how we think about public safety or how we're thinking about you know, land use planning and economic development. Climate is at the core of all of this. And I think we need to be training the next generation to be thinking of this as this all society problem.
Which again means there are innumerable opportunities you don't have to jump. If you get worried about climate change, that doesn't mean you have to jump into climate science. You have to get familiar with climate science, but even in the humanities, the arts, I know dozens of really creative artists who are involved, including helping cities design spaces that are greener and more pleasurable and more resilient. So that's just like bringing that knowledge, that action capacity into all the disciplines feels really valuable. There's a really good question here that maybe for Robin. What are the main challenges to issues to assess vulnerability to climate change at the local level? How can we better engage stakeholders in the process? This is Elia Machado.
Yeah, I think that it's, you know, it is really a challenge. I agree that even when we were working with community groups on the ground in the work in New York City, we were always still wondering, what about those communities that are so disconnected that there isn't a presence of a community group to help them to try to get to sort of the almost like the most vulnerable spaces. And I think just maybe even what Dan said earlier about sort of all agency approach, this idea of like, there's a role for the Department of Health, there's health, and sort of, there's a role for sort of educational entities. There's sort of spaces where we can, I think, connect with those communities that aren't necessarily a researcher going in and saying, hey, I'm doing a study, can I work with your community? But sort of that, those broader opportunities to engage. And I think maybe just back, even just like a little bit back on the other question, this idea of engaging in climate change. Like I teach a course called Climate Change in Society, and I think there's probably maybe 5% of the students in the class are climate scientists, but the rest of them are, they're in health, they're in, education, they're in business, they're in, every aspect of academics. And one of the things that we sort of emphasize is just this idea that climate change every single person will be engaging and will be addressing climate change in whatever career trajectory they end up in, whether it's, nursing, whether it's insurance, whether it's teaching. So that's sort of having that base knowledge around climate change. I think we all get that opportunity to engage, for better or for worse.
I couldn't agree more. And Marshall, here's where we'll get into the communication component here too. One thing that I've learned, especially now that I'm in a university, is that there's a huge need for better communication across universities, across disciplines, not just from the university out. But I'll tell a little quick story on Columbia. There's a guy in sociology, Gil Ayal, he's an expert in expertise. He wrote the book on expertise and how it either is ignored or embraced. That's a fantastically important skill, right? In thinking about climate and communities. And there's another guy at Columbia, Peter Coleman, who runs the Difficult Conversations Laboratory, which is an amazing resource. This is like the biggest, we have so many difficult conversations on race, on climate, on so many issues. They don't know each other. They didn't know each other until I introduced them. I'm like, so that seems to be part of this too, right? It's to have a successful ecosystem of change in a city or country. It feels like we need to have more of that kind of cross-fertilization as well as the in-out fertilization. Does that feel achingly familiar?
Oh, sure. I mean, again, I didn't grow up in a university. I like to say, like I said, I spent much of my career at NASA before I came to a university. And one of the things I immediately noticed is just how siloed things were in terms of departments and so forth. It's getting better. But here's the challenge. We need more interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, and transdisciplinary work for sure. And I think we're starting to see it. But one of the interesting things is when I kind of interact and engage in NSF panels and people that are evaluating this new interdisciplinary world that we strive for, people still speak different languages and say different things and don't understand the interdisciplinary at hand. For example, I can say a model, and as a weather climate person, I'm thinking about all of these equations being solved to predict the weather 5 days from now, or a climate model, whereas someone else in a different field might be thinking of a model in terms of empirical data that's being fit to these data points. So we do speak different languages. This is why one of the things that I am on record as saying that we have to get out of the ivory tower, because if we don't, then people with agendas and narratives will fill the gap that we leave. And so you know that very well, Andy, and the things that you do and the things that I do. I would share a Forbes blog that I wrote several years ago called The 9 Tips for Communicating Science to Non-Scientists. And I offer some tips for all of us, whether you are a scholar at my career stage or a student listening in today. Because again, as I alluded to earlier, in many cases, you're not being taught those skills as a part of your graduate programs. You just kind of have to figure them out. So that article is a really good sort of template for how to sort of engage when you're talking to your city council, or you're talking to the Rotary Club, or a faith-based group on these topics, because they're really the places where we have to kind of move the needle. I would also recommend, it's an older paper now by Somerville and Susan Hassel. It was published in Physics Today several years ago. For those of you that are on the science side, it's about climate science communication. They offer some very practical things and tips to do in that regard. And finally, I will mention something that just came out in case there are any journalists like Andy. There's Susan Hassel's organization. They just this week released a climate class that can be taken by journalists. And you can take it at your own pace. And so Susan Hassel, Hassol, she's out there on Twitter somewhere. I don't know. I think it's at Climate Communication, maybe her Twitter handle. I'm not sure. That's something that I would actually recommend. I hope it's not just for journalists. It may be, right, because it's a really good resource. I did one of the modules as a part of that on extreme weather attribution to climate change.
I'll look into it right away, because a lot of what I'm doing at Columbia these days is we're fostering the capacity for journalists and other communicators to.
Yeah, I'll pop the link. I'll pop the link in the chat right now. I have it.
So now there's some targeted questions coming in from students and other listeners. It's just a great mix here. And this is, I think we're on the track toward identifying paths forward. I'd like to think about paths more than solutions, because again, this is a tough area. It takes time to come to an end point, and we're in a changing climate. Change changes. So thinking about capacities to get people together to get in a tough problem feels more action oriented than worrying about a particular outcome. And here's a couple of questions. Well, one is very specific for WEACT. How can students engage with WEACT? Are there internship possibilities? And I'll ask Dan the same question. And so Sonal.
Yeah, there's some really easy ways to engage where you need no one to give you a green light, but just sign on up, and that's to become a WEACT member. If you just go to weact.org /membership, or you can just, I think a lot of students that are young can move through our webpage pretty easily here. But yeah, you can become a member really easily, and then you get access to our monthly membership meetings, all the different programs we're running. We have a lot going on right now, lots of workshops. We're doing a teach-in on Wednesday about a new initiative we're helping drive with other groups that is around banning gas and new construction hookups in New York City. It's a new policy avenue. It's just at the very beginning stages of discussion and kind of figuring out how to make that happen. So we're teaching people about what that means on Wednesday, so everyone can join that. And you can find that on sort of our events page through WEACT. And the other ways is we have working groups, particularly for anyone listening to this, you would fit perfectly into our climate justice working group. You can sign up for that by becoming a member, and then you can send a message to climatejustice@weact.org, I think is the email. I'll type it in the chat in a bit. You can send the email and say you're interested in being a part of it, join our meetings. They happen once a month, but depending on if there's events going on or projects going on, there's like more room to get involved. We have people help facilitating workshops on cooling centers right now, for example. Working group members are helping us like move that forward. So there's a lot of ways you can get involved there. In terms of internship, it's based on just like a need-by basis. So if you're ever interested, you can submit an application. I think it's internships@weact.org. So at any time, anyone, feel free, please, send us your interest and tell us you want to apply. We don't have a specific program open at this time, but we kind of accept based on sort of on a rolling basis and a need-by basis. So there's multiple ways you can get involved, but I'll start with become a member. It's a $25 a month. I mean, not a month, a year contribution, but we do offer kind of help if that's not doable. So yeah, that's the easy way.
And if anyone else knows of internship or other kinds of options for young people coming up through the coming months, if you could just pop in. Dan, I don't know what the city does in that context.
Well, we've certainly had some pretty robust internship and urban fellow programs and AmeriCorps internships, generally in the sort of college and grad school opportunities. The pandemic has thrown a little of that for a loop with hiring freezes and other things, but I think we're all thankful that with the stimulus and state and local aid coming through, we've seen layoffs for city workers being taken off the table. I think it's going to open up a lot of continued opportunities to restart those other internship and other opportunities. So I would just say, one, look out for things on the city's own sort of hiring websites and the regular annual internship program. And the other is also look for opportunities in your own communities. And I think, finding opportunities with organizations like We Act or other local community organizations around the city is immensely rewarding and impactful, and a great way to get a foot in the door as well, and to get to know these issues in your community.
And I think social media can play a role. Young people who are on social media can help amplify We Act and other initiatives in ways that can build connections with their communities. That gets to this, back to my arena, but also Marshall's, in the sense that, well, as a colleague, when I was teaching at Pace University, used to say, Maria Lusque, professor there, social media only works if you're social. In other words, you have to be out there trying to make a difference. Otherwise, as Marshall said, the zone will be flooded with the opposite. And I'm sure that's true for all of you, right? Does anyone who, and I won't ask each of you if you're active on social media, but for the city, it's more complicated. You're part of a institution where you can't just sort of be yourself all the time. Although Dan, you're pretty active on Twitter, right?
There's a fine line of making sure that I'm speaking for myself and not on behalf of the city in those channels. But I think I've found it rewarding and helpful to build those connections, and people that I've interacted with just online that have become friends or colleagues, or been a way to be able to describe what the city's up to and build relationships either with other cities or other organizations. It's been really helpful. And so I think you're right. You have to actually put the time into doing it, but the rewards are there if you do it right.
Well, and that maybe Robin and Marshall too on that front. I think people forget that social media, as I was saying earlier about disciplines talking to themselves, Twitter has an incredibly active community on all of these questions: geography of climate, the sociology of climate, the climate modeling. There's active community conversation that I'm sure has built relationships that have ended up in papers and in relationships going forward. Robin, I don't know if that's part of your landscape, but maybe you could quickly weigh in. We have a couple more minutes and I want to end, actually hold that thought, because we're right down to the wire here. And the key question that came in was a simple one. Essentially, what do we do today? If you're a young person or anyone listening here, what's one step you could take to get us further down the line? A year ago, when I started my Sustain What show, an old friend said that's the thing he asks every week. What's something I could do tomorrow? So maybe, because we're right toward the end, each of you just offer one actionable step that someone listening can take, or that we can take as a community, to take us further toward that vision that the Biden administration is laying out and that we know has been there for a long time. Maybe we'll start with Robin.
Yeah, that's a tough question in terms of just getting forward, but I think maybe one of the most meaningful and important steps is to recognize that you can change, that the recognition that climate change is a social problem. There's a ton of science on it, and we think of it as distant and far away and something in the global environment, but actually it is foundationally a social problem. So what you eat, where you drive, the decisions that you make, you can make a difference. I think that's, for me, just that recognition is such a critical step.
The social climate, as some call it. And Marshall, your last sort of go forth and do one thing.
Yeah, my go forth and do one thing, particularly noting who the audience is. I would say in your spaces, whether it's TikTok or Snapchat or among your peer groups, convey climate messaging in a way that's not about trend lines, graphs, anomalies, and science jargon, but about so what. Give your peers and your family the so what and the kitchen table issues as you convey your messaging.
And Sonal?
Yeah, I guess mine is when you're thinking about climate change and when you're kind of talking about it, I think this is sort of what Dr. Shepard is saying, like, or just related to it, when you're talking about it with friends or family members that aren't as involved or aren't as kind of stressed about it, I think it's important to connect it to anti-racism work. Think about how that's really related, because it is so related. I think racial justice is at the core of climate change. And I think that's something that really resonates with people. So think about how when you talk about climate change, you can connect it there.
Community change. And Dan, maybe one thing is that government is not always the enemy, right?
That's right. And I mean, I would honestly, the first thing that always comes to mind on this is register to vote, get involved in our democracy, in politics, because we saw it in the last election. People voted on climate as well as a number of other things. And, at the national level, and then Marshall, again, everyone in Georgia, it made a big difference. And we did not get the outcomes that just happened in Congress without people stepping up and voting and getting involved that way. So
fantastic. Well, and Renuka, thank you so much. Renuka, did you have a go forth? No, it's fine. There'll be more opportunities. This is all the time we have for this session. Thank you all, Renuka, for organizing, Sonal, Robin, Marshall, and Daniel. If anyone out there has additional questions that haven't been answered, do use the networking section of this platform to contact the panel. And social media for those who are on there. I'm at Revkin. Up next is a 30-minute lunch break. However, we hope that you'll join us for an environmental themed art show, Eco Urgency, an environmental film showcase from Lehman College students and alumni, followed by the second keynote of the summit, Working to Achieve Climate Justice in New York City, delivered by the fantastic Peggy Shepard from We Act. What a great event you've put on. And this is just the beginning. Through the day, tomorrow, I can see this track toward actionable outcomes. Thank you all for being here today. Thanks to my panelists, and go forth.